We're at the Ritz-Carlton in Chicago with Matt Price. Some lovely kind of hotel background music for our kind of chat today. So he is the Director of Strength and Performance Science for the LA Kings. His 11th year with the org, 4th year in this role, 7 years before that as head S&C. How are you doing today? And thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is pretty cool that we get to be in your hometown and get a chance to chat.
Yeah, part of the 1080 family. So he's been a power user for a while, being on the Sprint, the Syncro, and most recently kind of the cable. So a little more philosophically, being a power user for a decade basically, how has, a little bit more philosophically, being on the 1080 equipment made you a better coach, training, programming, all that stuff, / if you were to not have any 1080 equipment anymore, what would still remain in your coaching, your programming, and your training?
Yeah, I mean, so to go back, like when I first came to the NHL, I mean, I'm a hockey guy. I worked in other sports prior to coming to the Kings. When I got there, there was sort of a way of doing things, right? Like, so traditionally, if you wanted to load athletes and do some strength and power training or hypertrophy training, it was almost always done post-game. I played low-level professional,
A Canadian.
Yeah.
A Canadian.
And so I understood what it felt like on your body after a hockey game. It's pretty grueling, right? You're beat up, you're sore, you're tired. And I never lifted post-game, but I also, played a lot longer in the past than I was coaching recently. It didn't make sense to me, but we did it. But when I got my hands on quantums and we started to understand the power of isokinetic loading and how big the force outputs were and what the adaptation was, we basically scrapped post-game training. We moved to inter-game training, which wasn't a popular move. It was, just not the way things were done.
So briefly, what is Isokinetic training and what's your sales pitch? So people might know what that is, just they've heard that phrase, but before you kind of continue, what's your sales pitch on what it is and why it's valuable?
Well, I mean, it's auto-regulated force output. I mean, we control the speed of the movement.
ISO, same, speed, kinetic.
Exactly, right. So we set a speed limit on the pulley, whether it's a push, a pull, or a lower body of movement. The machine will not move any quicker.
Then
However,
0.3 meters a second, 0.4, 0.5.
Right, and the harder you pull against the machine, the higher the forces.
Back.
Right. Yeah. Now, you can give that a 10% effort, you can give that 100% effort.
But it's the same speed.
Speed doesn't change.
Eccentric only, which is a big piece.
That's huge. So as we sort of established a couple of movements we really liked, the athletes understood the concept of the isokinetics. They understood that the harder they pushed or pulled, that the forces would go up. We were getting major CNS stimulation, all through auto-regulated loading, super safe, no muscle soreness, and athletes started to really gravitate towards it. And I'd been told when I was first hired in this league, you can't make an athlete stronger in season, just don't beat them up. Well, we started to see strength gains in season. We saw guys who kept getting stronger and stronger and stronger, and year over year, we saw force values continue to climb, and that was how we got into the Syncro system. So two quantums is a Syncro. At one point, our athletes just maxed out a single machine. We're like, dang, we're gonna need to have two of these things running. And I mean, we probably doubled the peak forces from when we first started to sort of when we peaked out or plateaued. Like, we had driven up peak force values so high by exposing them to this isokinetic loading.
No soreness and in season.
No soreness in season, and just like really high frequency dosing, right?
With
like
buy-in from the players.
Buy-in from the players, 2 to 4 times per week. Athletes loved it. So that to me was probably one of the biggest changes. I don't know if it's like a philosophical change, right? Like, we're not going to train post-game, we're going to train intra-game. But again, just a better understanding of the power of that loading parameter and what it could do for an athlete.
Yeah.
Our schedule's hard. They're playing every other day. You don't feel awesome every day. So sometimes, 100% effort is 70% of your peak output. In an isokinetic loading, that's okay. That's the best you have. That's an auto-regulated output. We're cool with that. If every day I gave them a 225-pound bench press or a 275-pound trap bar deadlift, depending on their neuromuscular state on that day and their recovery from previous games or whatnot, we could be putting them at risk, right? They may not be prepared for that load, despite us seeing, hey, normally you can handle that no problem. Well, today you can't. So it also created a layer of safety in the training. So obviously the athlete trusted it, felt good with it. We were more confident with it, and it just sort of reshaped the whole in-season training paradigm.
So with isokinetics and the self-auto-regulated force, because it pushes you back as much as you pull it basically at that velocity, where does that come into play with the rehab?
Yeah, good question. The cool thing about the 1080, like whether it's, in fact, it could have been any of the machines, because in a rehab we don't need huge loads, but particularly around the shoulder joint, in hockey we end up with a lot of shoulder issues. You've got this machine that can handle thousands of newtons of peak force, but the cool thing is it can also handle tens or 20s of force, right? Like it's a huge spectrum.
At the same velo, you can have 10 or you can have 1,000.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Really, really cool stuff. So one of the use cases that we find really beneficial is an athlete that's had a shoulder injury, and they're getting back to a reasonable level of function. You're sort of through the initial acute phases, but when we want to have them start pressing and pulling, we can use an isokinetic load and have them push or pull against that as long as it remains pain-free.
Yeah, the phrase you said, pull with no pain, I thought.
Pull with no pain,
yeah.
Right? And because we have live feedback, the athlete is sort of watching their force output. They might start at a comfortable load or sort of comfortable intensity. Say they might pull at a 4 out of 10. How'd that feel? Felt good. Try a little harder. Yep, that felt good. Forces come up. That felt good. And you iterate this across a few reps. All of a sudden, they might do one rep where they say, it wasn't great. Okay, let's back it off. Now we've sort of settled in on some 5 or 6 out of 10 intensity, and they're pulling and actually producing force at the max level they're safely able to do. So very different than a rubber band or a traditional pulley or some free weight.
Accidentally overloading a bar or something.
Exactly, yeah. So another sort of layer of safety here that's built in with isokinetic loading is, I've said it before, auto-regulation. So, and it builds confidence really quickly, right? If they're very unsure of the shoulder joint, all of a sudden they're feeling pretty good about a couple of different movements where they're in control. They get to determine and dictate the load. And that's a really powerful thing.
And with that, you can still progress it either by making the speeds faster over time or just keeping it at the same load, and then every rep you get the force output of how much they're pulling into it. So there's still can be progressive overload or tracking over time even within the same velo, right?
100%. Whether it's session to session, it might progress, like I said, 5 out of 10. Now we're 6s, we're 7s, and they can feel and see the changes over time, right? Data's there. Hey, last session you were here, now we're here. Obviously, allowing for more velocity is a change in intensity. So if the particular movement could become more difficult by allowing more velocity, there's one of your options. Of course, slowing it down might also be the driver of intensity. So you can certainly play with that, and then just increasing volume, which is pretty straightforward. But there's so many micro adjustments that can be made, and which is nice. I'm not micro adjusting on 25 athletes every day, but when you're in this one-on-one setting and you're dealing with a very specific injury and you're trying to do some very detailed work, those micro adjustments are really important. And, we'll baseline these types of things. So like various push-pull patterns, we know here's what you look like healthy preseason, left, right. Hey, here's where we're at now. Okay, hey, look at that injured side. You're getting really close to preseason numbers. There's a lot of things that you can do there that not only gives the athlete confidence, but the medical staff. Hey, listen, ATs and the PTs, look at this is where we've been able to progress them to. This is where we started the season. When it gets time for medical clearance, the doctors and like I said, the medical staff can take that and feel confident that they've got an athlete who's ready for the next steps, whatever those might be.
So to summarize, the Isokinetic training with that type of load has taught you the value of microdosing in season, finding creative ways to avoid or mitigate the things you don't want, soreness, lack of player buy-in, things like that. And then also this value of kind of auto self-regulated load kind of in rehab. So those are some of the general things, if I'm kind of hearing you correctly, where that's just applied through Isokinetics, but you now are a believer of those things.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about Isokinetics here, and to backtrack, that was not why I got into the 1080 equipment, right? I was all about eccentrics. We got an eccentric overloading, and that was going to be the magic potion. Because Isokinetics were, getting strapped into a chair.
Yeah, just the big biodecks.
Big biodecks, extend your leg, do some of this type of stuff. But now with the, with the quantums or the cables or even the Sprint 2, you have so many degrees of freedom to move with an isokinetic loading. There's really no restrictions on how you either want to test or train with that type of setting. So it just opened up a huge box of opportunity for us to play with. And we still really like eccentric overloading. I think that's another fantastic loading parameter in traditional strength training. I think it's just money on the table, right? Like you can always do a little more eccentrically, and it's an easy thing to just have there in any sort of traditional strength training exercise. But the Isokinetics was probably the biggest game changer for us from, like you said before, in-season training, rehab. It checked a lot of boxes with the athletes and just really sort of changed the way we approach things.
That's a good segue, almost like you knew what I was going to ask you next. But so if you're at Matt Price's bodybuilding gym, decked out in 1080 stuff, it's just money on the table. It's so easy. If you're going to do all the work, bump up the eccentric overload to get a little bit more of that kind of force, tissue damage if you're going for hypertrophy or whatever it is. We talked about kind of the self-organization of eccentric overload, but so it makes sense for your bodybuilding kind of journey and everything. But specifically for athletes, what is the value that you found kind of in the eccentric overload?
Yeah, I mean, we all know that, neuromuscularly we're stronger eccentrically than we are concentrically, right? And so if you think about any basic movement, it really doesn't matter what it is, arm curl, triceps, a row, it doesn't matter. To ever sit there and have your concentric and eccentric load equal, to me, doesn't make sense, right? Like if you're gonna do a row at 50 kilos, put 60 on the eccentric, right? It's free money. It's a little extra load. It's going to compound over time. It's a no-brainer for me. So what I've seen is, particularly with myself and with athletes, is when you get the eccentric load right in relation to the concentric, so just a little bit of trial and error.
Have you found a good percent of eccentric overload?
It really depends on the movement. Obviously, a 50% overload at 10 kilos isn't the same as 50% overload at 75 kilos. But there's a little trial and error there. But starting small and adding to that eccentric side of the ledger, it's a pretty easy iterative process to play out. So the most common thing you see right away is, you do a particular movement. I'll take bicep curl, for example, because it's a single joint movement and it exposes those. It's very simple, but exposes those muscles pretty quickly. So I had an athlete and we're going to do a 50% overload bicep curl. So nice and smooth up. And even though they've been prepared for this, just a lot of, shaking.
It kicks in quick. It's very smooth.
Yeah, and then that's the first rep. And then the second rep becomes a little smoother and a little smoother and a little smoother. And then we get through three sets of exercises. And it's really changed quickly, right? That intramuscular coordination has really, really come around. And they feel it. It's like instant, right? Like within 5 minutes, there's been a change in their neuromuscular system. And we can kind of tap into that across a lot of different movements.
Because they need to.
They need to.
Yeah.
And the movements become smoother. There's better control over the movements. Obviously, the strength adaptation's significant, especially as they continue to get stronger and stronger. And we can increase that eccentric load more and more, and they're able to tolerate that with the tissue. It's a really powerful loading parameter, and every athlete notices it almost instantly. So it's really cool.